you have your Bible, go ahead and be opening to Nehemiah Chapter 11. Nehemiah Chapter 11 is where we'll be studying this morning. We're looking at this year the importance of rising and building. And this book is about rebuilding the walls around the city of Jerusalem and what it shows us about the work of restoration. And each chapter has been showing us something about an attitude or a disposition that must be embraced if we want to be about the work of restoration. And so we've looked at chapter 1 with supplication, that is learning to be people of prayer again. Chapter 2 about preparation. If we're going to do things, we need to be sure we're prepared and ready and know where we're going. Chapter 3, coordination, being able to divide up work and to have people accomplish it. Chapter 4, dedication in the face of insults and other things. Chapter 5 is about conversation or our manner of life, the way that we treat one another in particularly, and how that will hinder the work of God. Chapter 6 is examination, and they finally complete the wall in that chapter. And then you remember in this second section from 7 to the end of chapter 13, we're looking at rebuilding the hearts of the people. And so we talked about the separation that took place in chapter 7 as they separated from themselves those who couldn't find their names in the genealogy. Chapter 8 was about education, when they began to read the book of the law again and began to understand what it is God wanted them to do. And then in chapter 9, they were moved to confession about their sin. And then in chapter 10, we called it consecration. They entered into a covenant again with God. And now where we come this morning in chapter 11 is we're looking at participation. Everybody is participating in the work. Now what's interesting is, and a number of people in their observations about this book have said it, is that in the previous chapters, especially some of the early chapters, the emphasis has been on the leadership of Nehemiah. But when you come to chapter 11, the focus shifts and the people become the central focus. We're seeing that people are executing these things. The best leader in the world can do nothing if people don't support the endeavor that he's trying to lead or she's trying to lead. And so ultimately, yes, leaders can be in certain ways responsible for successful ventures. But in the grand scheme of things, many times what it is we're trying to accomplish is too big for one person to claim credit. And so it's really the people who accomplish it. The leader may have the vision, he may have kind of an idea of what he wants to do, but the people are the one who buy in and execute that vision. And that's what we're seeing in this chapter. Things are coming to a close, and they're going to have to repopulate Jerusalem. Now, what we have to understand is that the work of God is certainly too big for one person. There's no way possible one person can do the work of God that He's called us to do, which we'll look at in more detail in just a minute. And so each person's participation is vital in the work of God. And until each person realizes their potential and why they are needed in those local churches may thrive and they may do some good things, but they will never do what they could do. Okay? They will never do what they could do. Or, as you might say, you might be able to transfer from being good to being great. And that's, as one writer once put it, it is a sin to be good when God has called us to be great. When He's called us to rise to certain levels and we continue to settle for lower levels of mediocrity, even if they might be somewhat good, they're not the standard to which He called us. And what is amazing to watch is what happens when each person in a congregation buys into what it is they can do, and they begin to execute those things with precision, and what gets done and changes that are made. That when you get a front row seat to that's a pretty spectacular thing to watch people realize their potential and then execute on it, and then the church just takes off. And of course, God takes care of the rest. And so that's what we want to look at this morning with the stone of participation. Tonight we're going to look in chapter 12 at the stone of jubilation. That is the joy that comes from having done the will of God. But for this morning we're going to look at the stone of participation where the people are moving. Now the background to what's going on in chapter 11, before we look there, let's go to chapter 7. Chapter 7, the wall has been completed in chapter 6. And we're given a hint of some things in chapter 7 that will help us understand 11. It says, now when the wall had been built, and I had set up the doors, and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites had been appointed, I gave my brother Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was more faithful and God-fearing man than many. And I said to them, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot, while they are still standing guard. Let them shut and bar the doors, appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own homes. The city was wide and large, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. Then if you come to the end of this chapter in verse 73, the very end of verse 73, and when the 7th month had come, the people of Israel were in their towns. And so they've been doing this great work of rebuilding the city. The problem is there's nobody living in it, right? Everybody had, before he came to reunite them and to rebuild the city, everybody had settled into their homes on the outskirts of the cities and in other villages. And so now you've got a completed city with nobody to live in it. I've seen that before in a subdivision. When I was in Oregon many years ago, we were passing by a place, and there were beautiful, elaborate homes, and nobody was living in them. And I asked Neil, who we were out there seeing and doing a meeting with, I said, why are these houses not inhabited? He said they built every one of these houses, and this was a base to station certain soldiers during World War II, and there was something that got into the ground that made this entire place unlivable. Brand new, state-of-the-art homes, probably starting at $500,000, and not one of them could be touched. Not one of them could be touched because it was unsafe to live there. And so you've got these beautiful, elaborate, completed things, but they're not being used. And so when you think about Jerusalem, you've got a city that's like that. The city has been completed. Now, there's some rebuilding to do on the inside, but nobody is really living in it. So that brings us then to chapter 11 and the task that is at hand for them in chapter 11. The first part in verse 1, it says, now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem. Some translations may read a little bit differently, and that's because the Hebrew text is a little ambiguous here. Does it mean that they already lived in the city, or does it mean that they moved into the city after its completion? Either way, it doesn't really change what's going on. I happen to believe that they already lived in the city. And so what you have, first of all, is the leaders of the people setting the example. They're living in the city, okay? Leaders, when they ask people to do something, leaders don't ask people to do something that they are not themselves willing to do. Leaders have to set the tone. They have to go out front and do it. And so they're going to call people, and we'll see that in just a minute, they're going to call people to live inside the city of Jerusalem again and to give up their comfortable lives that they've built in their villages to start over again in the city of Jerusalem. Now, that would be difficult to bear. Think about being a person who is being asked by these leaders, now we want you to come in and repopulate Jerusalem, but now we're going to live in our estates and our mansions that are away from the city. I mean, some people might do it, but it's going to be a harder sell, right? Whereas if the leaders are already there, they're not asking people to do anything they're not willing to do. And so the leaders are setting the tone by making their residence within the city of Jerusalem in order to repopulate it. So this is what happened at the latter part of verse 1. It says, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 of the 10 remained in other towns. And so basically, there are two ideas here. So there's casting lots, which biblically can be Proverbs 16 and verse 33. It can be the will of God revealed through casting lots. Think of the tribal allotments in the book of Joshua. They cast lots, and that's how God told them where the tribes were to settle. The replacement for Judas in Acts chapter 1, they cast lots, and God revealed who it was that he wanted to serve in the office of an apostle. It's also possible that this is not necessarily God ordained. It's just a way of, say at the end of chapter 10, they cast lots to see who would take certain jobs. I happen to think this is probably more of something that God wanted them to do, that this is God revealing who he wants living in the city. And so basically, we're going to take 10% of the population that has gone out into the villages and settled there. We're going to ask 10% of them to move into the city, to repopulate it and to rebuild it, okay? And so that would make people more comfortable with it if they were chosen through the will of the Lord on those things. Now, here's what we have to keep in mind. What they're being asked to do is incredibly difficult. Okay? Now, I want to be careful, and we'll talk about this in the next point in verse 2. Every single person that's doing what they're doing, whether they're living in the villages or they're living in the city of Jerusalem, they're doing the will of God. They're doing hard work. But the people who are being asked to give up all of that and to move into the city, you could say to a degree they're being asked to sacrifice a little bit more than others. Okay? I think that's a fair analysis. To leave everything you've built behind and to move into the city and to basically start over, where you don't have a real estate market. You don't have established revenue coming in. You're starting from scratch. Okay? And so both sides are being faithful to the will of God. Of course, some, and we'll see in just a little bit later when we get to the application of this, it's kind of like a Luke chapter 10 situation. You've got people who serve and people who listen, and it's not really a difference between what is right and wrong, but between what is good and what is best. And so that's kind of a nuance that's taking place here. And then, as we move forward, you have the willingness of the people in verse 2. It says, "And the people blessed all the men who willingly offered to live in Jerusalem." That is, the people praised the ones who volunteered. They didn't wait for it to be revealed. They didn't wait to draw their straw or to cast their lot. They just simply went and lived in Jerusalem. And the word that's used here, they felt compelled, is the idea of an inner compulsion. They felt a drive that said, I need to be a part of the rebuilding process. Not just rebuilding the walls, but actually rebuilding the city itself. I want to be a part of that. And the very fact that the people bless and praise them tends to give us the idea that even the people in the villages are saying, that's making a sacrifice that's a little bit higher than the one that we're making by moving into the city. And so you have the willingness of them to go and to work. All right? Now, as we progress forward, we're given the places where they are to live. So we have a lot of genealogies, and don't let these genealogies throw you. Just understand the basic structure of them, okay? So you have two places where the work of God is going to be fulfilled. You have mention of Jerusalem, the city, and then you have mention of the villages, okay? So in Jerusalem, the city, in verses 3 through 24, you have different designations, and if you'll just watch the headings at the beginnings of these paragraphs, it will tell you what's going on. And in verse 4 through, the chiefs of the provinces are in verse 3. These are the chiefs of the provinces who went to live in Jerusalem. In verse 4, you have some sons of Judah go live in Jerusalem. In verse 7, you have the sons of Benjamin that go to live in Jerusalem. In verse 10, you have priests. In verse 15, you have Levites. In verse 19, you have gatekeepers. In verse 22, you have overseers of the Levites. These are all different categories and groups of people who are willing to go and to live in the city of Jerusalem. Okay? They're going to do the work of God of rebuilding the city. Now, some people might look and say, okay, it says priests and Levites, but didn't priests and Levites have to live in the city? That's kind of where their job was. The answer is no. Because in the time of David, he set up and divided the priesthood, because there were so many priests, he divided them into different orders, 24 orders, in which they would come and serve week-long rotations twice a year. Now, during the 3 major feast days, every order would show up. So basically, the priests and Levites would come and work a total of 5 weeks a year at the temple. There are 2 weeks on rotation, one at the beginning of the year, one toward the end of the year, and then there are 3 weeks of feast days throughout the year itself. And so, other than that, they lived in the cities and they taught the people and served their communities that way. And so, here you have the groups of people who are willing to go into Jerusalem to do the work. Then, in the rest of the chapter, you see a list of villages in verses 25 to 36. Here are all the different villages where people are living. And some of these villages, when you look at their locations, are a little bit dangerous. They're almost in enemy territory. For an example, in verse 35, Ono. You remember, at the beginning of this book, they wanted to meet Nehemiah in the plain of Ono. They wanted him to meet on enemy territory. And so now you have certain Israelites who are volunteering to move into that particular area. And so what we've got as we look at this chapter, with a lot of names and genealogies, but we have to learn how to see the structure of the genealogy, and that helps us to draw the application correctly. Okay? And so in this work, we learn something about participation. 100% of the people are locked into doing the will of God. Some are doing it in Jerusalem, Others are doing it in the villages. But they're all doing the will of God. Now that leads us to the application side of this, where we'll spend some time talking. And so when we think about for us, when we look at this chapter, which doesn't take us long to analyze and break through once we understand the way it's flowing, let's look at the application side of this. First of all, they had a work to do, and so do we, okay? We have a work to do in the church that God has called us to. Now, some people classically refer to the work of the church. If they're going to talk about the work of the church, it's usually three things: evangelism, edification, and benevolence. There's also a way of looking at that, saying that actually the work of the church is evangelism, and edification and benevolence are a way to fulfill evangelism. So there's some difference of opinions about how that should be worked out. I'm going to give you, when I look at the New Testament and just kind of survey what it is that God has called us to do, this is what I think the Bible is saying that the church should do. And the first thing that we should do as we do that is talking about the Great Commandment. How can we really talk about the work of the church without talking about the Great Commandment, right? When Jesus was asked the greatest command in the law, and he said, you love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and all of your strength. And the second is like unto it, verse 31, you should love your neighbor as yourself. That's what we're called to do. And all of Christianity is really summed up in that statement, because he was asked, what is it that governs really all the rest of the laws in the law of Moses? And this was the answer he gave. And so we're being called upon to love God. Now look, if we don't first love God, we're not going to be able to love our neighbor. And we're certainly not going to be about the work of ministry, which we'll see here in just a minute. And so the first thing we're called to do is to develop a vibrant and a growing relationship with God himself. That is the work of the church. When I sit down, when you sit down, and when you are opening your Bible in your private Bible study, and when you're bowing your head, or however you choose to do it, driving in your car with your eyes wide open, I hope, and you're praying, you're doing part of the work of the church, because you're building your relationship with God. And if every member will do their work to build their relationship with God, the entire work will benefit. That's part of our work, is to grow more deeply in our love for God. And as we grow more deeply in our love for God, we will grow more deeply in our love for our neighbor. That we learn to love our neighbor the same way that we love ourselves. Now, what does that look like? Well, I guess it kind of depends, doesn't it? You see Jesus' parable in Luke chapter 10 of the Good Samaritan. What is that in response to? The question of who is my neighbor? And the answer of the parable is, whoever is in need, that's my neighbor. Everybody is my neighbor. It's not just societal or class or religion based. It's every single human being made in the image of God. That's my neighbor. So, how do we love our neighbors as ourselves? I'm going to be honest with you. I'm getting really, really hot right now. So, how do we love our neighbor as we love ourselves? What is one of the things that is fundamental about us that sometimes we refuse to our neighbor? We want patience, understanding, and forgiveness. We want patience, understanding, and forgiveness. When we make mistakes, we say, what? Don't jump all over me. Be patient and help me to do better. We want understanding. Try to understand what I'm saying. Someone blows up. For an example, we say something and somebody blows up at us and we say, that's not what I meant. You're not understanding what I'm saying. What are we saying? I want to be understood. Forgiveness. When we do wrong, we want to be forgiven when we feel the weight of that. The question is, can we do those things for people with whom we disagree? Can we do those things for every single person? Can we try and live a life of understanding or of patience with people that says, you know what, they didn't handle it correctly, but you know, I haven't always handled things correctly either. And so I'm going to be patient and not write a person off because they didn't respond the way that maybe they should have. Number 2, understanding. I'm going to try and understand your world and where you're coming from, and not just expect you to understand my world and conform to it. I'm going to do the hard work to get to know you and where you're coming from, and let that flavor and season how I treat you. And then forgiveness. As one writer once put it, he said, I basically have come to the conclusion that I will never refuse to forgive a person until they have done me more wrong than I have God. I will never refuse to forgive another person until they have done me more wrong than I have God. What's his point? That's never going to happen. Loving my neighbor as myself, that's part of my work. So when I go out and I'm interacting with people, when I'm interacting with people at restaurants, when I'm interacting with people at work, when I'm interacting with people at the store, I'm doing the work of God by loving my neighbor as myself and being patient and gracious and kind. Now, the second idea under the Great Commandment, is another greatness called the Great Commission. Now, the reason it's called the Great Commission is because there's a limited commission in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus sends his disciples to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Here, in the Great Commission, he sends them to make disciples in all the world. And so instead of just being to Israel, it's now to all the world. And so the Great Commission is, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. That's what the original text reads. Some translations will say teach. It's not necessarily a bad translation, and I just don't know that it captures everything Jesus has in mind. So go make disciples of all the nations, and there are two ways that you make, or two parts of making a disciple. The first has to do with conversion. Baptizing them into the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. So you teach them the gospel and they're converted. So the first part of making disciples is converting people. The second part of making disciples is cultivating people. Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And so it's not enough where we're simply converting people and then turning them loose, but that we're actually growing and cultivating them and helping them to understand Christianity more and more and conforming them more and more to the image of Jesus. So when we're out preaching the gospel, when we're having an evangelistic conversation with someone, that's involved in the Great Commission, but also when I'm helping another Christian to grow. That's also part of the Great Commission because I'm making disciples. I'm either converting them or I'm cultivating them. Okay? Now, under a third heading found in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 12, it's what the apostle calls the work of ministry. He talks about why he gave leaders to the church. And he says he gave the apostles and the prophets and the evangelists and the shepherds and teachers to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up of the body of Christ. So to equip the saints for the work of ministry. Work. Ministry, the work of ministry can take on so many different angles, right? Think about the commands in Scripture that we have just in some of these areas. So James 1:27, pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this, to visit or to render assistance to the widows and the orphans in their affliction. There's a ministry to pay attention to widows and to orphans. There are ministries, and by the way, you see that again in Acts chapter 6. The Grecian widows had been neglected, so you also see another establishment of widows and orphans. So there's that ministry. Furthermore, when you look at Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me drink, and I was a stranger and you took me in, and I was naked and you clothed me, and I was sick and I was in prison and you visited me, you came to me, you helped me. We learn about all these different areas of ministry, and these are just a few. We learn about all these areas of ministry. where we're going to be involved. Now, one of the reasons why I think God has such a diversity of ministry for us is because we have such a diversity of people. Right? Some people have a knack for certain ministries. They're good at it. One place I preached, there was the man that we had over our benevolence program had been a former drug addict. And what that man was able to see and understand about benevolence, I never would have dreamed in a million years. He knew how to put together benevolent bags because he knew what food traded for on the drug market. You can trade in your canned goods for drugs. He knew what they traded for. He knew how to help spot a person who had a drug problem when they came for help, and he knew how to help a person with a drug problem when they came for help. There are ministries so vast and so broad. And honestly, many times there are more ministries than we have people to bring them to fruition. And so we have to find those ministries, and we have to find the people who would thrive in those ministries, and we have to line them up. Jesus is not saying you've got to do ministry only in one particular area or you're not doing ministry. And ministry, by the way, is not a profession as we think of it. So I am not a person who went into ministry because I became a preacher. That is not going into ministry. I went into ministry when I was baptized into Christ. Every single person goes into ministry or service when they're baptized into Christ. I went into preaching at a different age, a different type of ministry. But every single person is a minister. Every single Christian is a servant. And they have to engage in ministry. Each person doing their part and engaging in those particular things is vitally important, and understanding that we have work that needs to be accomplished. Now, let's think about the places of these works a little bit more for just the last few minutes. First of all, when it comes to ministry, leaders have to lead. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 3, in that context, he's talking to elders, and he tells them to lead, not lording over the flock, but to lead by examples. Okay? To lead in the sense of examples, to take the step forward. Now, in that context, he's talking about elders, but you could just as easily say the same thing about deacons. Okay? Just as easily say the same thing about Bible class teachers or whoever's over what particular ministry, because, you know, if you want a ministry to get things done, you usually need somebody that's responsible. I hate to put it this way, but at the top, somebody who can kind of oversee everything and make sure things get coordinated and done the right way. And so you've got to have a person who's there, and the leader has to lead by example. Now, what happens with a lot of ministries is they get halted because whoever is leading in those particular ministries, they don't try and be innovative anymore. They don't try and rethink through it. They lose why they're doing it. It kind of gets pushed to the side instead of them constantly thinking about what can be done to produce and to develop and to make this ministry better. We say, well, this is the way we've always done it, and so that's the way we're going to continue to do it. Okay, that might be fine. If the results are good, that's a fine way to do it, right? If it's working, stick with it. But the definition of insanity is what? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And so every person who has been tasked to lead a ministry has a very serious conviction before God to keep that ministry in the forefront of their minds and what they can do to lead it and the people they're getting involved and how they're going to get people involved and all of those things to set the tone and set the example, because a lot of ministries have a lot of willing people, but they don't have a leader. And because they don't have a leader, people's ideas feel like they're ignored, and so they get pushed to the side, and then they get discouraged, and nothing ever really gets accomplished. And so leaders begin with setting that tone. The second thing that we have to realize from this text in Nehemiah chapter 11 is some people are willing to go after harder jobs. Okay? Some people feel a compulsion to go after harder jobs. Okay? And every congregation has these. If a congregation of God's people exists, it's because it has people who are willing to do the hard things. Some people are not willing to do those hard things. That doesn't necessarily make them bad. It's just they're not willing to do them. Okay? I know a lot of people who are good people, but they're not going to be elders because being an elder is an incredibly hard task. That doesn't mean they're not faithful to the Lord. But being an elder is a volunteer task. Even if you doubled your pay every year as an elder, you'd still make nothing. And then, honestly, probably the least encouraged group of ministry leaders that the church has. Because a lot of times what they hear the most of are complaints and not thankfulness. But you have these people who, not just elders, but in every other part, and every eldership knows who their people are, that no matter what happens, they're going to get involved and they're going to do the right thing. They're going to make it happen no matter what it is. And we've got people who are that way, and that's the way we have to exist. But the thing we have to keep in mind is that every job is important. Because of time, we can't look in too much detail at 1 Corinthians chapter 12, so I'll give you the structure of this. There are two attitudes he deals with when he talks about every part of the body, and it's composed differently. There are two attitudes. In verses 14 through 20, he addresses the attitude that says, they don't need me. I don't bring anything to the table, they don't need me. The Apostle Paul says that's not true. To say that I bring nothing to the table and that the church does not need me is to say that God did not gift me with anything. And I'm going to tell you that's just not true. I may not understand areas where I'm gifted, and I may not understand how those giftednesses plug into a local church, but every person is gifted. Every person brings something to the table that can help a local church. So he deals with the attitude that says, they don't need me. And then in verses 21 to 26, he deals with the attitude of other people who say, I don't need them. I'm going to lead, but I don't need them. This person is expendable. They want to leave, let the door hit them on the way out. No, because when people walk away, they're walking away with giftings that we could have used to the glory of God. And so, the point is that we must all work. In Ephesians 4 in verse 16, Paul, using this body image again, says, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself in love. It makes the body grow. When each part works properly, the body grows. Now, you remember the famous writer who uttered these words or wrote these words? Everybody thinks of changing the world. No one thinks of changing himself. Listen, over the last 15 years and even more than that, but especially in the last 15 years, I've heard a lot of people say, churches are supposed to be this. We want the church to be this, and we want the church to be that, and we want the church to rise to this, and we want to be a part of a church that has this and does that. I don't disagree with you. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself the question, what am I doing to make that happen? You see, it's easy to shove that responsibility onto other people and say, you're responsible for why this isn't happening. You see, everybody thinks of changing the church, but so many people never think of changing themselves. The church should have this ministry, it should have this leadership program, it should have this. Now, okay, who's going to lead that? Well, I'm not going to. At some point, we've got to take responsibility and participate. And for me personally, it's very hard to listen to a person complain whose hands are clean. It's very hard to listen to a person complain about the church whose hands are clean. The church should be this. The church should do that. Where are you then? Because when I look at your hands, they haven't touched a thing. When I look at ministries, they haven't touched a thing. It's hard to listen to someone who doesn't even try, who says this is the way it should be done. And what this text says is we have to raise ourselves to this level of participation where everybody gets to work, everybody has a job. In every congregation, there are vital moments in its life when they have the opportunity to go up to another level. Okay? Every congregation exists on a certain level, and they have other levels they can rise to. It doesn't mean that they're any less faithful, but it does mean that they can rise to different levels and be more effective. So every congregation has their levels, and they have the next level they can go to. Now, here's what has happened in a lot of churches I've seen. They've been poised to go to the next level, but either, number one, they refuse to do it. They either refuse to do it, or they don't realize it when it's in front of them. And here's the danger about not realizing when it's in front of you. You won't realize it the next time, and you won't realize it the next time, and you actually begin to go the opposite direction. What I'm convinced of is that this church is poised to take a step. I'm convinced of that. That's not something I say. Okay? That's not something I say because, I'm supposed to say that and that will rah-rah us to get to the next level. I don't care about rah-rah. Rah-rah doesn't produce results. This church is ready to go to another level. The question is, are we ready to go? It's there, and it's in front of us. But now the choice is ours as to if we want to simply exist and be good, or we want to rise to a different level and experience a whole new level of Christianity. And experience a whole new level of what it means to go to church and what it means to be the church and what it means to make differences in the lives of people at a higher level. That's the choice we have to make. So I guess that's really the question. What choice are we going to make? We can sit around and we can complain about some things that, we can sit around and we can go, we do some things really well, and we can sit around and complain and say, there's some other things we don't do really well, or we can actually decide, we're going to identify the things we do well and get better at them, or we can look at the things that we don't do well and say, here's some things we're going to get better at, and this is what we're going to do it. That's our choice. God has already told us He'll help us and make us successful in the process. We just got to make a choice. I think I know what the choice is going to be, and I'm kind of excited to see what's going to happen. So the question for us this morning is, do you want to participate in the work of God? It's the greatest work on the earth. If you come with a penitent faith, confessing Jesus to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins, enter into the body of Christ, work, ministry, assignments, things to do. Or maybe as a New Testament Christian, I have not participated, I have not been involved, I have not put myself forward. And I'm ready to decide that that's going to stop now. I'm going to put myself forward, I'm going to do things, I'm going to step outside of my comfort zone, and I'm going to do things. Or maybe I just haven't been who I need to be in other areas. Or maybe I just need encouragement. We just want to help one another. If we can do that this morning, let us know as we stand and sing this song.